Section 15 of the Convivio. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by K. Hand. The Convivio by Dante Alighieri. Translated by Philip H. Wicksteed. Treatise 4, Chapters 6 through 9. Above, in the third chapter of this treatise, promise was given to discourse of the loftiness of the imperial authority and of the philosophic. And therefore, having discussed of the imperial authority, my digression must further proceed to the inspection of that of the philosopher according to the promise made. And our first business here is to see what authority means, because there is more need of knowing it here than in the discourse concerning the imperial authority, which by reason of its majesty does not seem to be questioned. Be it known, then, that authority is naught else than the act of an author. This word, to wit auctor, without the third letter C, may spring from two principles. The one is that of a verb, dropped very much out of use in Latin, which signifies as much as binding words together, to wit audiobook. And whoso regards it well in its first form will clearly perceive that it shows its own meaning, for it is made of naught save the bonds of words, that is to say, of the 5 vowels alone, which are the soul and juncture of every word. And it is composed of them in lithe manner, to figure the image of the tie. For beginning with A, it turns thence to U, and then goes straight by I to E, whence it goes back and returns to O. So that truly they image forth this figure, which is the figure of a tie. And in as far as author is derived and descends from this verb, it is understood only of poets, who have bound their words with the art of music, and with this significance we are not at present concerned. The other principle whence author descends, according to the testimony of Uguccione in the beginning of his derivations, is a Greek word which is called autenten, which is as much as to say in Latin worthy of faith and of obedience. Thus author, so derived, is understood of every person worthy of being believed and obeyed. And hence comes that word of which we are treating, namely authority, whereby we may see that authority is as much as utterance worthy of faith and of obedience. It is manifest that Aristotle is most worthy of faith and obedience. And that his words are the supreme and most lofty authority may thus be proved. Amongst the workers and artificers of divers arts and operations which are ordained for one final operation or art, the artificer or operator of that final art should be mainly obeyed and trusted by all, as he who alone considers the ultimate goal of all the other goals. Wherefore the sword maker and the rein and saddle maker and the shield maker should trust the cavalier, and so should all those trades which are ordained for the art of chivalry. And inasmuch as all human activities demand one goal, to wit, the goal of human life, whereto man is ordained as man, the master and artificer who explains and considers this should be mainly obeyed and trusted, and this is Aristotle; therefore he is most worthy of faith and of obedience. And to perceive how Aristotle is the master and leader of the human reason, inasmuch as he is intent upon its conclusive activity, it behoves us to know that this our goal, which each one naturally desires, was sought for in very ancient times by the sages. And inasmuch as they who desire this goal are so numerous, and the appetites differ in almost every single case, though there be one universal goal, yet it was right hard to discern it, as that wherein every human appetite would find direct repose. There were then certain very ancient philosophers, of whom the first and chief was Zeno, whose view and belief was that the goal of this human life is solely rigid integrity, that is to say, rigidly to pursue truth and justice without respect to aught, to show no grief, to show gladness at nothing, to have no sense of any emotion. And this is how they defined this integrity: that which, apart from utility and apart from result, is for its own sake to be praised by reason. And they in their sect were called Stoics, and of them was that glorious Cato, of whom I dared not to speak above. There were other philosophers whose view and belief was different from theirs, and of these the first and chief was a philosopher who was called Epicurus, who, seeing that every animal as soon as it is born, and as though directed by nature to the due goal, shuns pain and seeks pleasure, said that this our goal was voluptuary. I do not say voluntary, but write it with a P. That is to say, delight without pain. And moreover, between delight and pain he placed no middle term, saying that voluptuous was none other than without pain, as Tully seems to recount in the first of the Goal of Good. And of these who are called Epicureans, after Epicurus, was Torquatus, the noble Roman, descended from the blood of the glorious Torquatus, of whom I made mention above. There were others, and they took their rise from Socrates, and then from his successor Plato, who looking more subtly, and seeing and perceiving that in our activities we might and did err by excess and by defect, said that activity without excess and without defect, according to the standard of the mean selected by our choice, which is virtue, was that goal whereof we are at present discoursing. And they called it virtuous activity. These were called the Academicians, of whom were Plato and his nephew Speusippus, so called because of the place where Plato studied, to wit, the Academy. And they did not take their name from Socrates, because in his philosophy nothing was affirmed. But Aristotle, whose surname was Stagirides, and Xenocrates the Chalcedonian, his companion, by means of the almost divine intellect which nature had imparted to Aristotle, coming to knowledge of this goal, and pretty much by the method of Socrates and the Academicians, put the finishing touches on moral philosophy and brought it to perfection, especially Aristotle. And because Aristotle set the fashion of discoursing while walking backwards and forwards, they were called, I mean he and his companions, Peripatetics, which is as much as to say they who walk about. And because the perfection of this moral science was brought to its limit by Aristotle, the name of the Academicians was quenched, and all they who learnt from this sect were called Peripatetics. And these yet hold sway over the world everywhere in teaching, and their doctrine may in a way be called the Catholic opinion, whereby it may be seen that Aristotle is he who directs and conducts folks to this goal, and this is what we wished to show. Wherefore, to sum up, my main contention is now obvious, namely, that the authority of the supreme philosopher, with whom we are now concerned, is in full and complete vigor. And it is not opposed to the imperial authority, but the latter without the former is perilous, and the former without the latter has a kind of weakness, not in itself, but because of the disorderliness of men, so that when the one is bound up with the other, they are most profitable and full of all vigor. And therefore it is written in that of wisdom, Love the light of wisdom all ye who are before the peoples. Which is to say, let the philosophical authority unite with imperial for good and perfect rule. O wretched ye who at the present rule, and O most wretched ye who are ruled. For no philosophic authority unites with your government, neither by your proper study, nor by the counsel of others, so that the word of Ecclesiastes applies to all. Woe to thee, O land whose king is a child, and whose princes rise up early to feast. And to no land may what follows be addressed. Blessed is the land whose king is noble, and whose princes eat in due season for necessity and not for luxury. Give heed who be at your sides, ye enemies of God, who have grasped the rods of the governments of Italy. It is to you, Charles and Frederick, kings, and to you others, chiefs and tyrants, that I am speaking. Behold who sit by your side to give counsel, and count how many times in the day this goal of human life is pointed out to you by your counselors. Better were it for you to fly low like a swallow than like the kite to make the loftiest wheeling over vilest things. Chapter 7. Since we have seen how the imperial and the philosophical authority, which seemed to support the opinions before us, are to be reverenced, we are now to return to the direct path of our contemplated progress. I say, then, that this last opinion of the vulgar has become so inured that without inspection of any argument, every one is called gentle who is son or grandson of any worthy man, although he himself be of naught. And this is where it says: And so inured is such false thoughts among us, that folk call that man a gentleman who can aver, I was grandson or son of such an one of worth, though he himself be naught. Wherefore be it noted that it is most perilous neglect to suffer a false opinion to gain footing, for just as grass multiplies in an uncultivated field, and mounts up and overwhelms the ears of corn, so that when one looks from a distance the corn may not be seen, and the fruit is finally lost, so false opinion in the mind, if not chastised and corrected, grows and multiplies, so that the ear of reason, to wit the right opinion, is concealed, and as it were buried and lost. Oh, how great a thing have I undertaken in this ode, desiring now to cleanse so weedy a field as this of the common opinion, so long neglected of this tillage. Verily I purpose not to cleanse it throughout, but only in those parts where the ears of reason are not utterly suppressed. That is to say, I purpose to set right those in whom some glimmering of reason still survives, in virtue of their favored nature. For of the rest no more heed is to be taken than of brute beasts, because it seems to me no less a miracle to bring a man back to reason when it has been utterly quenched, than to bring back to life him who has been 4 days in the tomb. When the evil state of this opinion of the people has been related, the Ode, clean out of the order of the refutation, incontinently smites it as a hideous thing, crying, but basest doth he seem to whoso looks on truth, to give to understand its intolerable perniciousness, asserting that such as say so lie to the very uttermost, for he is not only base, that is ungentle, but the very basest, who is descended from good forebears, but is himself bad. And I give an illustration from a way that has been pointed out, concerning which, to make it clear, I must put a question and answer it as follows. There is a plain with certain fields and footways, with hedges, ditches, boulders, logs, and well nigh every kind of obstruction, save on its narrow footways, and it has snowed so that the snow covers up everything and gives it the same aspect all over, so that no trace of any path is to be seen. A man comes from one side of the plain and desires to go to a house that is on the other side, and by his own ingenuity, that is, by his perception and the excellence of his wit, guided by himself alone, he goes by the direct path to the place he purposes, leaving the footprints of his steps behind him. After him comes another and wishes to go to the same house, and needs only to follow the footprints already left, and by his own fault the path which the other had contrived to find for himself. Without guidance this man loses although he has guidance, and he twists about amongst the thorns and the ruins, and reaches not the quarter where he should go. Which of these should be called worthy? I answer, he who went before. And what should the second one be called? I answer, most base. Wherefore is he not called not worthy, that is base? I answer, because he should be called not worthy, that is base, who having no guidance should not journey rightly, but because this man had guidance his error and his fault cannot be exceeded, and therefore he is to be called not base but basest. And thus he who is ennobled in race by his father or by some forebear, and perseveres not therein, is not only base but basest, and worthy of all scorn and vituperation, more than any other churl. And that man should be on their guard against this lowest baseness. Solomon in the 22nd chapter of the Proverbs bids him who has had a worthy forebear, pass not the ancient boundaries which thy fathers set up. And earlier, in the 4th chapter of the said book, he declares, the path of the just, that is of the worthy, goeth forward as a shining light, and that of the wicked is darkened, and they know not whither they plunge. And finally when it says, and he hits nigh to who should be a corpse yet walk the earth, I say to his further disgrace that such a basest one is dead, though he seem alive. And here be it known that a bad man may rightly be called dead, especially he who departs from the true path of his worthy forebear. And this may be demonstrated thus. As Aristotle says in the Second of the Soul, life is the being of the thing that is alive, and since life is after many fashions, as in plants to vegetate, in animals to vegetate and feel, in men to vegetate, feel, move, and reason or understand, and things should be named from their most noble part, it is clear that life in animals, I mean brute animals, is feeling, and life in man is exercising the reason. Therefore, if his life is the being of man, renouncing the exercise of reason is renouncing his existence, and so it is being dead. And does he not renounce the exercise of reason who gives himself no account of the goal of his life? And does not he renounce the exercise of his reason who gives himself no account of the path he ought to take? Assuredly he does. And this is most manifest in him who has the footprints before him and regards them not. And therefore Solomon says in the 5th chapter of the Proverbs, he shall die because he had no discipline, and in the multitude of his foolishness shall he be deceived. That is to say, he is dead who does not become a discipline, and who follows not the master. And such an one is most base. And of him some may say, how is he dead and yet walks? I answer that the man is dead, but the beast survives. For, as says the philosopher in the Second of the Soul, the powers of the soul are graded, as the figure of the quadrangle is of higher grade than the triangle, and the pentagon of higher grade than the quadrangle. Thus the sensitive is of higher grade than the vegetative, and the intellectual of higher grade than the sensitive. And so, just as if you withdraw the last side of a pentagon, you have a quadrangle left, but no longer a pentagon, so if you withdraw the last power of the soul, that is the reason, the man is no longer left, but something with a sensitive soul only, that is, a brute animal. And this is the meaning of the second verse of the Ode we have in hand, wherein are laid down the opinions of others. Chapter 8. The fairest branch that rises from the root of reason is discrimination. For, as Thomas says in Prologue to the Ethics, to know the relation of one thing to another is the proper act of reason, and this is discrimination. One of the fairest and sweetest fruits of this branch is the reverence which the lesser owes to the greater. Wherefore Tully, in the first of Offices, speaking of the beauty which glows in integrity, says that reverence is part of it, and as this reverence is a beautifying of integrity, so its opposite is a befouling and demeaning of the same, the which opposite may be called irreverence, or mutiny in our vernacular. And therefore Tully himself, in the same place, says, carelessness to know what others think of him is the mark not only of an arrogant but of a profligate man, which is no other than to say that arrogance and profligacy consists in being without knowledge of oneself, which is the foundation of the standard of every kind of reverence. Wherefore I, desiring to observe all reverence of speech, both to the prince and to the philosopher, while removing what is pernicious from the mind of certain, in order thereafter to let in upon it the light of truth, before proceeding to refute the opinions before us, shall make it clear that in refuting them I do not argue with irreverence either towards the imperial majesty or towards the philosopher. For were I to show myself lacking in reverence in any other part of all this book, it were not so foul a blot as if I were to do it in this treatise, where in treating of nobility I am bound to show myself noble and not churlish. And first I will show that I do not presume against the authority of the philosopher, and then I will show that I do not presume against the imperial majesty. I declare then that when the philosopher says, that which the majority think cannot be absolutely false, he does not mean to speak of outward or sensuous judgment, but of inward or rational. For a sensuous judgment in accordance with the majority would often be most false, especially in the case of the objects common to more senses than one, wherein the sense is often deceived. Thus we know that to the majority the sun appears to be a foot in diameter, which is most false, for according to the research and discovery which human reason with its attendant arts has made, the diameter of the body of the sun is 5 times as great as that of earth and half a time over. And since the diameter of the earth is 6,500 miles, the diameter of the sun, which seems to sensuous judgment to measure a foot, is 35,750 miles. And hereby it is evident that Aristotle did not mean sensuous judgment, and therefore, if I aim only at refuting this sensuous judgment, I am not going to counter to the purport of the philosopher, and therefore neither do I offend against the reverence due to him. And that it is the sensuous judgment which I purpose to refute is manifest, for they who so judge only by what they perceive of the things which fortune can give and take away. For when they see alliances and distinguished marriages and stupendous buildings and great possessions and mighty lordships, they suppose them to be the causes of nobleness, nay, they suppose them to be nobleness itself. Whereas if they judged by rational appearances, they would say the opposite, namely, that nobleness is the cause of these things, as will be seen below in this treatise. And even as I speak not counter to the reverence of the philosopher in refuting this, as is plain to see, so I speak not counter to the reverence of the empire, and I purpose to show why. But since we are arguing in the face of the adversary, the orator must take great heed in his speech lest the adversary draw matter therefrom to obscure the truth. I who am speaking in this treatise in the presence of so many adversaries cannot speak briefly. Wherefore if my digressions are long, let no one marvel. I say then that to show that I am not irreverent to the majesty of the empire we must first consider what reverence is. I say that reverence is no other than the profession of due submission by patent sign. And perceiving this we must distinguish between irreverent and non-reverent. Irreverent implies privation, non-reverent implies negation. So irreverence is withholding due submission by patent sign. Non-reverence is the not avowing of submission which is not due. A man may repudiate a thing in 2 ways. One kind of repudiation clashes with the truth when due profession is withheld, and this is properly disconfessing. In the other way a man may repudiate without coming into collision with the truth, when he will not confess that which is not, and this is properly denying. As for instance, for a man to repudiate the assertion that he is altogether mortal is to deny it in the proper sense of the word. Wherefore, if I deny reverence to the empire, I am not irreverent, but I am non-reverent. For it is not contrary to reverence, inasmuch as it does not clash with it. But even as not being alive does not clash with life, but being dead clashes with it, for it is the privation of it. Whence being dead is one thing, and not being alive is another. For not being alive pertains to stones. And because death implies privation, which cannot be save in a subject of the habit in question, and stones are not subjects of life, therefore they should not be called dead, but not alive. In like manner, I, who in this case owe no reverence to the empire, am not irreverent in renouncing it, but am non-reverent, which is not mutiny nor a thing of blame. Nay, reverence, if reverence it could be called, would be mutiny, for it would result in a greater and more real irreverence, that is to say, irreverence towards nature and towards truth, as will be seen below. Against this error that master of the philosophers, Aristotle, guarded himself in the beginning of the Ethics, when he says, "If we have two friends, and one of them is the truth, we must comply with the truth. But verily, since I have admitted that I am non-reverent, which is denying reverence, to wit, denying by patent signs submission that is not due, we must investigate how this act of mine is denying and not disconfessing; that is to say, how in this case I am not duly subject to the imperial majesty. And since the argument must needs be lengthy, I purpose to demonstrate it in a chapter of its own next following." Chapter 9. To see how in this case, that is in refuting or confirming the emperor's opinion, I am not bound to submission to him, the argument conducted above in the 4th chapter of this treatise, concerning the imperial office, must be called to mind; to wit, that the imperial authority was invented for the perfection of human life, and that it is, by right, the regulator and ruler of all our doings, because so far as our doings stretch, so far the imperial majesty has jurisdiction, and beyond these boundaries it does not extend. But like as every art and office of man is confined to certain limits by the imperial office, so is this empire itself bounded by God within certain limits; nor need we marvel at this, for we see that the office and the art of nature is bounded in all its activities. For if we would take the universal nature of the whole, it has jurisdiction so far as the whole universe (I mean the heaven and the earth) extends; and this is up to a certain fixed boundary, as is proved in the 3rd of the Physics, and in the 1st of Heaven and Earth. Therefore the jurisdiction of universal nature is bounded by certain limits, and by consequence so is the particular. Moreover, he doth bound her who is bounded by naught, to wit the prime excellence, which is God, who alone with infinite capaciousness comprehends infinitude. And to perceive the limits of our operations, be it known that those only are operations of ours which are subject to the reason and to the will; for albeit there are digestive operations in us, these are not human but natural. And be it known that our reason is related to 4 kinds of operations, to be considered separately; for there are operations which it only considers and does not perform, nor can it accomplish any of them; for instance, things natural and supernatural, and mathematics, and operations which it considers and accomplishes by its own act, which are called rational, as are the arts of speech; and operations which it considers and accomplishes in material external to itself, as are the mechanical arts. And all these operations, though their consideration is subject to our will, are not subject to our will in themselves; for however much we might wish that heavy things should rise upward by nature, they would not be able so to rise; and however much we might wish a syllogism with false premises to be a conclusive demonstration of the truth, it would not be one; and however much we might wish a house to sit as firmly when overhanging as when straight, it would not; because we are not, properly speaking, makers of these operations, but their discoverers. It was another that ordained them, and a greater maker who made them. There are also operations which our reason considers as they exist in the act of will, such as attacking and succouring, standing ground or fleeing in battle, abiding, chaste, or wantoning. And these are entirely subject to our will, and therefore we are considered good or bad on their account, because they are properly ours in their entirety; for so far as our will can have its way, so far do operations that are really ours extend. And inasmuch as some equity is to be observed, and some iniquity to be avoided, in all these voluntary operations, and this equity may be missed for 2 reasons, either lack of knowing what it is, or lack of will to pursue it, therefore was reason invented, both to point it out and to enforce it. Wherefore Augustine says, if it (equity) were known to men, and when known were observed, there would be no need of written reason. And therefore it is written in the beginning of the Old Digest, "Written reason is the art of good and of equity." It is to write, to demonstrate, and to enforce this equity that the official is appointed of whom we are discoursing, to wit the emperor; and to him we are subject to the extent of those operations, properly our own, of which we have spoken, and no further. For this reason, in every art and in every trade the artificers and disciples are, and ought to be, subject to the chief and the master thereof in the respective trades and arts; outside of which the subjection is annulled, because the chieftaincy is annulled. Wherefore we may in some sort say of the emperor, if we wish to figure his office by an image, that he is the rider of the human will. And how that horse courses over the plain without the rider is manifest enough, and especially in the wretched Italy which, without any mediator at all, has been abandoned to her own direction. And be it observed that the more special a thing is to any art or discipline, then the more complete is the subjection therein. For if the cause be enhanced, so is the effect. Whence we are to know that there be some things so purely matter of art that nature is their instrument, such as rowing with the oar, where the art makes an instrument of impulsion, which is a natural movement, or as in threshing leaven, where the art makes an instrument of heat, which is a natural quality. And it is herein most of all that subjection is due to the chief and master of the art. And there are things wherein the art is an instrument of nature, and these are arts in a lesser degree, and in them the artificers are less subject to their chief, as in committing seed to the earth, wherein heed must be given to the will of nature, as in issuing from a port, wherein heed must be given to the natural disposition of the weather. And therefore we see that in these things there often arises contention amongst the artificers, and the superior asks counsel of the inferior. There are other things which are not a part of an art, but seem to have some relation to it, and as to this mistakes are often made. And in these things the learners are not subject to the artificer or master, nor are they bound to trust him, so far as the art goes. Thus fishing seems to have some connection with navigation, and knowledge of the virtues of herbs with agriculture, yet they have no common discipline, inasmuch as fishing comes under the art of venery and under its command, and the knowledge of the virtues of herbs under medicine or under some more general discipline. In like manner, all these points which we have discussed with reference to the other arts may be noted with reference to the imperial art. For there are regulations in it which are pure arts, such as are the laws concerning matrimony, concerning slaves, concerning warfare, concerning the successors to titles ; and as to these we are entirely subject to the emperor without any doubt or hesitation. There are other laws which have, as it were, to follow the lead of nature, such as constituting a man of sufficient age for managing his own affairs, and herein we are not completely subject. There are many others which seem to have some relation to the imperial art, and herein those were and are deceived who believe that in such matters an imperial pronouncement carries authority. For instance, as to manhood, we are not to accept any imperial judgment on the ground of its being the emperor's. So let us render to God that which is God's. And accordingly we are not to trust nor accept the Emperor Nero, who said that manhood was beauty and strength of body, but him who should say that manhood is the apex of the natural life, and that would be the philosopher. It is therefore evident that defining gentlehood is not a part of the emperor's art. And if it is not a part of his art, then in treating of it we are not subject to him, and if we are not subject we are not bound to reverence him therein, and this is exactly what we were in search of. Wherefore we may now with full freedom and with full courage of mind smite upon the breasts of the depraved opinions that are current on the earth, in order that the true opinion by this my victory may hold the field of the mind of those for whom it gives vigor to this light. Section 16.